My name is Naomi Carter. I'm 25 years old, and for as long as I can remember, my parents told me I was adopted in spirit. Not legally, not officially, just different enough to explain why I never quite belonged. I believed them, right up until the night my grandmother handed me an envelope and told me not to open it at home. Growing up, my parents said it like it was kindness. "You're adopted in spirit," my father would say, smiling gently, like it was something special. I didn't question it. I was 8 the first time I heard those words, and at 8 you assume adults tell the truth. Especially when they say it so calmly. It explained things. Why my brother Lucas got birthday parties with themes and speeches, while mine were quiet dinners that somehow turned into celebrations of his latest achievement. Why his name was always said first. Why mine felt like an afterthought. I didn't resent him. I adjusted myself instead. By the time I was 25, I'd learned how to disappear politely. So when my parents told me to come home for what they said was a family gathering, I didn't expect anything for myself. I never did. That's what made it easier for them to erase me again. The house looked perfect when I arrived. Lights everywhere. Cars lining the street. Laughter spilling through open windows. Inside, the living room was full of people I barely recognized. Friends, colleagues, neighbors, holding glasses and congratulating my brother on his MBA. A banner hung across the wall with his name in gold letters. No one said happy birthday to me. Not once. I stood near the kitchen, holding a plate I didn't remember being handed, while my father clinked his glass and called Lucas his legacy. People applauded. I smiled because that's what I'd learned to do. That was when my grandmother stood up. Ruth Carter didn't raise her voice. She never had to. The room quieted anyway. She looked at my father, then my mother, and said evenly, "You've forgotten whose house this is." You could feel the air shift. No one laughed this time. She crossed the room, took my arm gently, and guided me toward the hallway. Her hand was steady. Her expression was not unkind, but it was final. She pressed a sealed envelope into my palm. "Don't open this here," she said. "Don't open it at home." Then after a pause she added, "You'll need to be alone when you read it." I didn't ask what it was. Something in her voice told me not to. I left the party without anyone stopping me. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and chose not to. I sat in my car for a long time before opening the envelope. The street was quiet. The house behind me glowed with celebration that wasn't meant for me. My hands were steady when I finally broke the seal. The first page wasn't long. Just a few lines. Typed. Precise. I read the first sentence once. Then again. And then I whispered out loud, "No, this can't be real." Because in that moment, I understood something my family had hidden for 25 years. Something that explained every silence, every dismissal, every carefully chosen word. Everything I believed about my place in that family was a lie. And to understand why that envelope existed at all, you need to know how my family erased me, slowly, deliberately, for my entire life. Our house always looked perfect from the outside. Trimmed hedges, clean windows, holiday wreaths on schedule. People use words like stable and lucky when they talked about us. I learned early that appearances mattered more than accuracy. The first time I heard the phrase adopted in spirit, I was 8. I remember because I'd asked why Lucas got a new bike and I didn't. My father knelt in front of me, voice calm, patient, almost practiced. "Families work differently," he said. "You're adopted in spirit, Naomi. That doesn't mean we love you less." I nodded because that sounded reasonable at 8. After that, the phrase became a shortcut. Anytime something felt unfair, it was the explanation. Why Lucas got picked up early from school. Why his mistakes were brushed off. Why my responsibilities always seemed heavier. "You're more mature," my mother would say softly. "You understand more." I did understand. I just didn't realize what I was being trained to accept. Lucas wasn't cruel. That's important. He didn't need to be. The system worked without him trying. He learned that things arrived for him automatically: attention, praise, protection. I learned that love was conditional on usefulness. Neither of us questioned it because it was all we knew. By middle school, the pattern was set. Lucas played sports. I kept the house quiet while he studied. Lucas forgot chores. I remembered them for both of us. If something went wrong, I was asked why I hadn't noticed sooner. Responsibility became my currency. My mother rarely intervened. She wasn't loud or cruel, just consistently absent when it mattered. She'd offer excuses in private, never corrections in public. "Your father means well," she'd say. "It's easier this way." I didn't know who it was easier for, but it wasn't me. My father framed everything as preparation. "You'll be strong because of this," he told me. "You don't need as much," he added, smiling like that was wisdom. I believed him. I worked harder. I asked for less. I learned how to shrink without disappearing completely. Birthdays made the difference obvious. Lucas's were planned weeks in advance. Guests, themes, photos. Mine happened quietly, usually combined with something else, a dinner, a holiday, an achievement of his. Once my cake had his name on it by mistake. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. By high school, I stopped expecting fairness. I focused on being agreeable, helpful, easy. Teachers praised my discipline. Relatives called me low maintenance. No one noticed that I never asked for anything anymore. That was the goal, even if no one said it out loud. College made the contrast impossible to ignore. Lucas left with his tuition paid, a car, and a monthly allowance. I worked 2 jobs and took on loans without complaint. When I mentioned it once, my father said, "This will build character." I didn't argue. I just adjusted again. The phrase "adopted in spirit" stopped sounding gentle. It started sounding permanent. Like a rule I couldn't challenge, only obey. It wasn't just an explanation anymore, it was a system. One that rewarded silence and punished need. There was only one person who never used that phrase. My grandmother, Ruth. She never treated me differently. Never explained me away. When she looked at me, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt known. At the time, I thought that was just love. I didn't realize it was also attention. Because while everyone else was busy justifying the imbalance, she was watching it happen quietly, carefully over decades. And the entire time I was learning how to disappear. Someone else was learning how to tell the truth. The older we got, the clearer the pattern became. Not in dramatic moments, but in repetition. Small choices made over and over that always landed the same way. Lucas forward. Me aside. When Lucas turned 16, my parents surprised him with a car. Not used. Not shared. New. They gathered us in the driveway like it was a ceremony. Keys presented. Photos taken. Applause. I stood off to the side holding my phone, because someone had to record it. When I turned 16, I got more responsibility. A longer chore list. Later curfews for Lucas meant earlier ones for me. If I questioned it, I was told, "You don't need distractions." That answer ended the conversation every time. Vacations followed the same logic. Lucas's interests decided the destination. If he wanted the mountains, we went to the mountains. If I suggested something different, it was labeled complicated. I learned not to suggest anything at all. Holidays were the clearest example. Lucas received gifts that hinted at futures, technology, tools, investments. Mine were practical. Clothes. Household items. Things that implied service. When relatives noticed, my father would laugh and say, "Naomi doesn't ask for much." He was right. I'd been trained not to. By the time college applications came around, the difference was no longer subtle. Lucas's tuition was discussed openly, confidently. Which school fit his potential? Which connections it offered? My plans were discussed in terms of affordability, loans, part-time work, being realistic. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, filling out financial aid forms alone. Lucas was out with friends celebrating his acceptance. My mother passed by, paused, and said, "You're so independent." I admire that. I wondered when independence became a requirement instead of a choice. During college, the imbalance turned into silence. Lucas came home to visits and check-ins. I came home when I could afford the gas. No one asked how tired I was. They assumed I was fine because I never said otherwise. I worked through weekends, through breaks, through exhaustion. Every paycheck went toward tuition, books, rent. When I mentioned stress once, my father said, "This will mean more to you because you earned it." I didn't know earning love was part of the deal. Lucas graduated debt-free. There was a party, beaches, photos framed immediately. When I graduated, my celebration was quiet and late. A dinner squeezed between other plans. My degree handed to me like a receipt. Still, I didn't confront them. I didn't accuse or demand explanations. Because the truth was, I already knew the answer. I just didn't want to admit what it meant. That the gap wasn't accidental. The only person who acknowledged it was my grandmother. She never compared us. Never excused the imbalance. She asked questions no one else did. Are you being treated fairly? I never answered honestly. I didn't think it would change anything. But she kept asking. Every visit. Every call. Watching. Remembering. Taking mental notes I didn't understand yet. At the time I thought she was just concerned. I didn't realize she was documenting a pattern. Because repetition isn't just evidence. It's proof. And when proof piles up long enough, it stops being ignorable. It becomes something else entirely. Something actionable. And the entire time my parents believed this was normal. Someone else was counting every imbalance. And deciding exactly when to stop it. My grandmother, Ruth Carter, had a way of noticing things without announcing that she'd noticed them. She didn't interrupt. She didn't accuse. She simply watched quietly from the edge of the room. And she remembered everything. Every year on my birthday she sent a card. Not flashy. Not expensive. Always handwritten. Always mailed early. And always signed with the same line at the bottom. The truth always surfaces. First, I thought it was just something she liked to say. A phrase from another generation. Something comforting, not literal. I never asked what she meant. I assumed it wasn't meant for me yet. When I was a child, she used to linger after family dinners. While my parents cleared plates and Lucas talked about his plans, she'd sit beside me and ask small questions. How are you sleeping? Do you feel safe here? Questions that didn't sound dramatic, but didn't feel casual either. If I answered too quickly, she'd look at me for a second longer. Like she was measuring the space between my words and the truth. Then she'd nod and change the subject. I didn't realize then that silence can be a form of listening. Or that listening can be preparation. There were other things too. Little details that didn't make sense but no one questioned. The house, for example. Whenever guests complimented it, my parents accepted the praise easily. But my grandmother never joined in. She'd smile politely and say nothing. Once, when a neighbor mentioned how generous my parents were to let Ruth stay, my grandmother's smile didn't reach her eyes. Later I asked my mother about it. She waved it off. Your grandmother exaggerates. She forgets things. But my grandmother never forgot birthdays. Never forgot names. Never forgot promises. Another time I overheard a neighbor say, your grandmother was smart to buy early. This place must be worth a fortune now. My father laughed a little too hard and changed the subject. I noticed, but I didn't press. I'd been trained not to. Every question about finances ended the same way. That's adult stuff. You don't need to worry about that. Focus on your own life. So I did. But my grandmother didn't stop watching. She didn't stop writing those cards. And she didn't stop repeating that sentence. The truth always surfaces. When I moved away for college, she called more often. Never to lecture. Never to warn. Just to ask how I was managing. If I needed anything. If I felt supported. Once, when I joked that I was used to being on my own, she went quiet. Then she said very calmly, you shouldn't have had to be. That was it. No follow-up. But the sentence stayed with me. Years later, after I graduated and moved back home briefly, I noticed she'd started organizing documents, folders, labels, careful stacks of paper. When I asked what she was doing, she said, putting things where they belong. I didn't know then how literal that was. My parents dismissed her more openly as time went on. They joked about her being old-fashioned, about her fixations. Lucas laughed along. I stayed quiet, because I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to believe that the imbalance in our family was intentional, or that someone else had noticed long before I did. Acknowledging that meant admitting I'd been erased on purpose. The truth is, my grandmother saw the pattern before I ever named it. She saw how love was rationed, how excuses were recycled, how silence protected the people in power. And she understood something I didn't yet. That patterns don't fix themselves. They have to be interrupted. I just didn't know when she planned to do it, or how public it would be. That answer came on the day my family erased me one more time and thought no one would notice. I turned 25 the same week my brother finished his MBA. That detail mattered, apparently, because when I came home that weekend, there was a banner stretched across the living room wall. Gold letters. Expensive paper. It read, "Congratulations, Lucas." There was no mention of my birthday, no cake with my name, no card on the counter, just my suitcase by the door and a list of things my mother wanted help with before guests arrived. I noticed. I said nothing. The house was full by early evening. Cars lined the street. People I barely knew filled the rooms, holding glasses I didn't recognize. Someone had hired a caterer. Another person adjusted the music. It felt like walking into a place where I wasn't expected but was still useful. My mother handed me a stack of plates and asked me to take them to the kitchen. My father nodded in my direction once, distracted, already mid-conversation. Lucas stood near the center of the room, relaxed, confident, surrounded by congratulations. I stayed near the edges, moving when asked, invisible when not. At one point someone asked whose birthday it was. My mother laughed lightly and said, "Oh, it's Naomi's too, but this is really about Lucas." The way she said really made it sound reasonable. The room laughed politely and moved on. I stayed quiet. Dinner was served at a long table. There were place cards for everyone. Mine wasn't there. My mother pointed to a chair near the kitchen and said, "You can eat later once things settle down." I nodded. I was used to eating after everyone else. Then my father stood up to give a speech. He tapped his glass and the room hushed. He talked about legacy, about ambition, about how proud he was to see his son carrying the family name forward. He never said mine. When he finished, everyone applauded. Lucas stood and hugged him. Someone toasted to the future of the Carter family. I watched from the doorway holding a dish towel, trying to understand when I'd stop being part of that future. Later, a guest asked my father what my plans were. He smiled thinly and said, "Oh, Naomi's independent. She's doing her own thing." The pause before independent felt deliberate, like a dismissal wrapped in politeness. Another guest asked if I lived there. My father answered before I could. "Not really. She comes and goes." The word really showed up again. I felt something settle in my chest. Then came the announcement. My father cleared his throat and said they'd decided to sell the house. He spoke confidently like it was a proud moment. The proceeds, he explained, would help Lucas start his next chapter. A business opportunity. An investment in the future. No one asked where I would go. No one looked at me. I stood there, realizing something I hadn't let myself consider before. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being removed. When someone finally acknowledged me, it was to ask if I could clear the table. I nodded and started gathering plates. My hands were steady. My face calm. Inside, something had gone very quiet. That was when my grandmother stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't interrupt dramatically. She simply pushed her chair back and said, "That's enough." The room froze. Everyone turned toward her, confused, uncomfortable. My father started to say her name, but she held up her hand. Not angry. Certain. "You've said quite enough for one evening," she continued. Then she looked directly at me. "Naomi," she said, "come with me." That was the first time all night someone had said my name like it mattered. And I had no idea what she was about to put in my hands. Only that whatever it was, it had been waiting a long time. My grandmother didn't rush me. She didn't grab my arm or raise her voice. She simply turned and walked toward the hallway, already assuming I would follow. And I did. Because when someone finally acknowledges you, you don't hesitate. We stopped in her bedroom. The door closed softly behind us, cutting off the noise of the party. The laughter. The clinking glasses. The speeches about legacy that never included me. The silence felt heavier but safer. She sat on the edge of the bed and reached into her purse. Not hurried. Not nervous. Like this was something she'd done many times before in her mind. Then she pulled out a thick envelope. Manila. Sealed. My name written across the front in her careful handwriting. She didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, she looked at me for a long moment. The kind of look adults give children when they know something is about to change. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't sad. They were resolved. "Do not open this here," she said. Her voice was steady. "No matter what they say. No matter what happens." That was the first instruction she'd ever given me that felt like protection. I nodded. She finally placed the envelope in my hands. It was heavier than I expected. Not physically, just enough to notice, but in a way that made my chest tighten. Like it carried weight beyond paper. "This is yours," she continued. "It always has been." Then she added quietly, "And you deserve to read it alone." I wanted to ask questions. I had so many. But something in her tone told me not to. This wasn't a conversation. It was a transfer. Before I could speak, she stood and smoothed the front of her jacket. When she opened the door, the sound rushed back in. Music. Voices. Someone laughing too loudly. My grandmother stepped into the hallway first. She didn't explain anything to them. She didn't announce what she'd done. She simply said, "Naomi is leaving." My father turned toward us, irritated. Leaving? In the middle of everything? My mother opened her mouth to object, but my grandmother spoke again. "She's not feeling well," she said. The statement wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was something better. Unchallengeable. No one argued. No one stopped me. They were too busy being confused. I grabbed my coat and my bag. Lucas didn't look at me. My father didn't say goodbye. My mother looked relieved. Like the night could finally continue uninterrupted. I walked out the front door holding the envelope against my side. The night air was cool. Quiet. The party noise dulled behind me as the door closed. I didn't open it on the porch. I didn't open it in the driveway. I didn't even open it when I got into my car. I sat there for a full minute, hands on the steering wheel, breathing evenly. Because some things deserve space. And whatever was inside that envelope felt like one of them. I drove a few blocks away and parked under a streetlight. The kind that hums faintly if you listen closely. I turned off the engine. The silence settled again. Only then did I place the envelope on my lap. The seal was intact. Unbroken. Untouched. That detail mattered more than I understood at the time. My fingers hesitated. Not from fear. From instinct. Because part of me already knew this wasn't just information. It was proof. I tore the envelope open carefully. Inside were several folded documents. Thicker paper. Official looking. My name appeared again. Printed this time. I unfolded the first page. I didn't read the whole thing. I didn't need to. The first line was enough. I felt my breath catch just slightly as I whispered, "No, this can't be real." The streetlight flickered above me. My hands started to shake. Not violently, just enough to notice. Because in that moment I understood something I'd never been allowed to consider. Everything I'd been told about my place in that family was built on a lie. And my grandmother had just handed me the truth. I didn't read everything at once. I learned a long time ago that rushing makes things blur. So I went line by line. Slow. Careful. Like the order mattered. The first document was my birth certificate. Not a copy. An original. Stamped. Signed. Dated. It listed my full name. My exact birth time. And then the names of my parents. Daniel Carter. Elaine Carter. There was no adopted. No asterisk. No explanation in the margins. I checked the date again. Then the place. Then the signatures. Everything matched. Everything I'd been told was suddenly wrong. I let the paper fall back onto my lap. All those years. All those explanations. All those careful phrases. Adopted in spirit. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't symbolism. It was a cover. The next pages were legal documents. Typed. Precise. Cold in the way only official language can be. They described a trust. Created the month I was born. Funded quietly. Managed professionally. Beneficiary. Naomi Carter. Not shared. Not conditional. Not delayed. Sole. I read that word twice. Then a third time just to be sure. Because it didn't align with the life I'd lived. The assets listed made my chest tighten. The house. The savings. Counts I'd never heard of. Numbers I'd never been allowed to imagine. At the bottom of the page was a signature I recognized instantly. Ruth Carter. My grandmother hadn't just been watching. She'd been preparing. The last item in the envelope was a handwritten letter. folded carefully, creased like it had been read before. Maybe many times. Naomi, it began. No title. No apology. Just my name. She wrote plainly. The way she always spoke. Direct. Unemotional. She explained that my father had asked her years ago to help balance the family. That Lucas needed more. That I was stronger. That I would understand. She said she didn't agree. But she also didn't intervene at first. Instead, she documented dates, conversations, decisions. Every time my parents justified less for me, she wrote, if they could explain it, they could repeat it. And if they repeated it, it would eventually expose itself. That line stayed with me. She ended the letter with a sentence that felt less like comfort and more like instruction. Truth doesn't need volume. It only needs light. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. My hands were steady now. My breathing even. Nothing about my childhood had been accidental. Not the silence. Not the excuses. Not the imbalance. They hadn't loved me less. They had planned it that way. I leaned back against the car seat and stared through the windshield. The street was empty. Quiet. Unaware that something had just shifted. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt clear. Because once a lie is exposed, it stops having power. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't guessing where I stood. I knew. And so did they, even if they didn't realize it yet. I didn't drive home right away. Instead, I sat there and let the information settle into my body. Not my thoughts, my body. Because that's where the damage had lived for years. Once I felt steady, I made one call. Mr. Hayes answered on the second ring. His voice was neutral, professional, like someone who deals in facts, not feelings. I told him my name. Then I told him what I had in my hands. There was a pause. Not concern. Recognition. Yes, he said. I was wondering when you'd call. That sentence alone confirmed everything. He explained the trust slowly, methodically, as if he expected resistance but not from me. It was airtight, irrevocable, created to activate only under specific conditions. One of those conditions had just been met. My grandmother's authority. The house. The accounts. The investments. None of it belonged to my parents. Not legally. Not ever. They were tenants, he said. By permission. Not ownership. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence again. The first call from my family came 20 minutes later. I didn't answer. The second came 5 minutes after that. Then another. Then 3 texts in a row. I didn't read them yet. I already knew the tone. Confusion first. Then urgency. Then correction. By the time I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the voicemail notifications had stacked. I listened to the first one. My mother's voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested practice. There's been a misunderstanding, she said. We just need to talk. The second voicemail was my father. Angry, sharp, already framing himself as wronged. You had no right to leave like that, he said. You embarrassed us. That word again. The third voicemail was different. It was Lucas. Quiet, uneven. I don't know what's happening, he said. But Dad says you're making things difficult. That was the moment I understood something important. They weren't panicking because of the truth. They were panicking because I knew it. The text came faster after that. Requests turned into pressure. Pressure turned into strategy. Let's keep this private. There's no need for lawyers. You're overreacting. This will hurt the family. I didn't reply. An hour later, my father called again. I answered this time. He didn't say hello. He asked me what I wanted. Not what I needed. Not what I felt. What I wanted. I told him the truth. I want this handled legally. The silence on the other end was immediate. Then came bargaining. He suggested paperwork. Agreements. Compromises. He said words like fair and reasonable, as if those concepts hadn't been absent my entire life. I told him my lawyer would be in touch. That's when his voice changed. He warned me. Not directly, but enough. You don't want to do this, he said. There are consequences. I agreed with him. Yes, I said. There are. The next morning, Mr. Hayes called again. He'd already received contact from my parents. Urgent. Demanding. Unprepared. They're asking you to sign a waiver, he said, to renounce your beneficiary status. I almost laughed. Almost. I told him no. Firmly. Without explanation. He scheduled an official estate reading for the following week. All parties required. No exceptions. When I hung up, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. This one was softer. Emotional. She said she was hurt, that she never meant for me to feel excluded. That families make mistakes. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I placed the phone face down. For the first time, I wasn't being pulled into the noise. I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't explaining my existence. I was waiting. Because I knew something they didn't yet understand. They thought they were walking into a conversation. They were actually walking into a reckoning. The conference room was smaller than I expected. Neutral walls. A long table. Too many chairs for a family that never sat together honestly. I arrived early. Not to prepare. Just to be present. Mr. Hayes nodded when he saw me. No small talk. No sympathy. Only professionalism. My parents arrived next. Together. Perfectly composed. My father wore the same confident expression he always did when he thought authority was on his side. My mother avoided my eyes. Lucas came in last. He looked different. Less certain. Like someone realizing too late that the floor might not be solid. Everyone sat. Mr. Hayes didn't waste time. This is a formal estate and trust reading, he said. All statements today are matters of record. My father leaned back in his chair. Relaxed. Almost bored. That told me everything. The lawyer began with dates. Legal language. Framework. Then he said my grandmother's name. The room shifted. He explained the trust's origin. The year it was created. The conditions under which it would activate. My father frowned for the first time. Then came the assets. The house. The accounts. The investments. Each item landed quietly. But the weight added up. My mother's hands tightened in her lap. Lucas sat forward. Then Mr. Hayes said my name. Full name. Clear. Unmistakable. Sole beneficiary. The words hung there. No echo. No drama. Just truth. My father laughed once. Short. Sharp. That's not possible, he said. There must be an error. Mr. Hayes didn't respond immediately. He reached into a folder instead and slid a document across the table. My birth certificate. Original. Stamped. Verified. No redactions. It listed my parents' names. Both of them. No adoption. No ambiguity. The room went silent. My father stared at the paper like it might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. My mother started crying. Quietly. As if volume might make it worse. Lucas whispered my name. Once. Then Mr. Hayes continued. He explained that my parents had never owned the house. That all payments had been made through the trust. That their authority over the property existed only through permission. Tenants, he repeated. Not owners. My father stood up. This is ridiculous, he said. She's twisting things. Mr. Hayes didn't look at him. He looked at me. Would you like to speak? He asked. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look angry. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm here to confirm what's already been proven. I looked at my parents. For 25 years, I continued. You told me I was adopted in spirit. That I should be grateful. That unequal treatment was normal. I paused. That wasn't guidance, I said. It was a cover story. Lucas looked down at the table. My father opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. At this time, he said, control of all trust assets transfers fully to Naomi Carter. There was no applause. No shouting. Just the sound of a system collapsing. My father sat back down. Slowly. Not defeated. Exposed. The meeting ended shortly after that. There was nothing left to say. As we stood to leave, my mother reached for my arm. I stepped back. Not aggressively. Deliberately. I'll be in touch through my lawyer, I said. That was all. As I walked out, I felt something unfamiliar. Not victory. Relief. But what I did next, that's what they never expected. I didn't leave the building feeling powerful. I left feeling clear. Clarity does that. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't need witnesses. 3 days later, my lawyer sent the formal notices. 90 days. That's what I gave them. Not out of kindness. Out of structure. 90 days to vacate the house. 90 days to transition accounts. 90 days to stop pretending this was a misunderstanding. No speeches. No ultimatums. Just timelines. My father didn't respond at first. Then he sent a message that was half apology, half strategy. I did what I thought was best, he wrote. You have to understand the pressure. I read it once, then archived it. Understanding doesn't erase impact. My mother called more often, sometimes crying, sometimes quiet. I should have protected you, she said once. I believed she meant it. But belief doesn't undo years of silence. Lucas surprised me. He showed up one afternoon without warning. No anger. No entitlement. Just honesty. I didn't know, he said. And I should have noticed. That was the first real sentence he'd ever said to me. We didn't fix everything that day. But we reset the terms. Respect first. Then proximity. The house felt different once the paperwork finalized. Not bigger. Not quieter. Just mine. I paid off my student loans in one transaction. Watched the balance disappear. Not because money solves pain, but because it removes weight you were never meant to carry. I moved my grandmother into the guest room. She pretended she didn't need help, then let me make her tea anyway. You did well, she said one evening. Not proudly. Factually. That mattered more. My parents moved into a rental across town. Smaller. Temporary. For the first time, they had to live without borrowed authority. And something interesting happened. They stopped calling me ungrateful. They started calling me Naomi. Boundaries will do that. Months passed. The story settled. No public apology. No dramatic reconciliation. Just consequences aligning with truth. And peace growing where pressure used to live. I still think about that phrase sometimes. Adopted in spirit. How it sounded gentle. Almost loving. How it functioned like a leash. Words shape reality, especially when repeated by people you trust. Here's what I learned. Worth isn't assigned by parents, or siblings, or who gets celebrated louder. Worth is inherent. And boundaries aren't punishments. They're proof that you finally believe that. If you've ever been the forgotten child, quiet one, the grateful one, tell me, how did you reclaim your place?